welcome you all to today's talk by Professor M. Thurston. Dr. M. Thurston is a senior research professor of China Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. In addition to her teaching responsibilities, she is the director of the school's Grassroots China Initiative. Dr. Thurston first visited China in 1978 and has been there dozen of times since, conducting research, working and escorting many American study groups and delegations around the country. Among her books and monographs are the Life of Chairman Mao, written in collaboration with Mao Zedong's personal physician Li Chuxi, Enemies of People, The Chinese Odyssey, Marching Towards Democracy, Political Change in Grassroots China, and China Bound. She is the co-author with Gyalo Tundu, the older brother of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, of the just published The Noodle Maker of Kalimpong, The Untold Story of My Struggle for Tibet. Dr. Thurston has written frequently for both academic and popular journals and newspapers, including the Atlantic Monthly, the China Business Review, Wilson Quarterly, the China Journal, the Washington Post, Boston Globe, and Christian Science Monitor. In addition to writing books on China, Dr. Thurston has served as a consultant to the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and was a researcher at the Fairbanks Center for East Asian Research at Howard University, and was a staff for the China programs at the Social Science Research Council in New York. I now request Professor M. Thurston to begin talk. Thank you.
Dr. Losang Senke is on his way from the Tibetan Children's Village to this place to moderate the session. In his absence, I will serve as a very poor substitute. But anyway, we extremely grateful that Dr. Ann Thurston has agreed to talk about her book, and Pandala has done an excellent introduction. So without any further ado, I invite Dr. Ann Thurston to talk about her latest book. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. And I want to make sure that the microphone is working. It sounds to me as though it is working. So I also want to thank Sempela and Palden and the whole Tibetan Policy Institute for my time here in Dharamsala. I've been here for almost a month teaching one of the courses here that I usually teach at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I've had a wonderful, wonderful time. I love my students. I love the Tibet Policy Institute. I love the staff and the leadership at the Tibet Policy Institute. So it's very, very good for me to be here. And I need to thank Sikum Lobsam Sangye for this invitation to speak here. And I will see him, I guess, in a few minutes. So let me start. I have titled my talk, I'm not sure if you ever saw the title of my talk, but I've titled the talk, Writing the Noodle Maker of Kalimpong. So what I want to do is what I want to start by doing is to sort of introduce you all and tell you all how it is that I came to do this book. So the story of how I came to write the Noodle Maker of Kalimpong begins with a good friend of mine named Elsie Walker, who is familiar, I'm sure, to some of you in the audience. She is a very long and very good friend of both His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama and Gyalo Dundrup. I met her some time ago when I was working in Tibetan areas of China, and we had become good friends. And at some point after I came to know Elsie, she was sort of designated by Gyalo Dundrup to help him find somebody to help him write his memoirs. Elsie came to me hoping that I would be able to do it. I think there were a couple of reasons that she wanted me to do the book. One of them is that she had read another book that I wrote with an elderly gentleman, the book The Private Life of Chairman Mao, which I wrote with Mao's personal physician, Li Jirsui, and I think some of you in the audience also know that book. And she loved that book. She loved the first chapter of that book, and she thought that I would be a good person to write Gyalo Dundrup's book. She also thought my first response to being asked to do this book was, my gosh, I'm not a Tibetan specialist. I'm a China specialist. There's no way I could do a book about Tibet. But her answer was that in fact it was good that I was a China specialist because Gyalo Dundrup has had close ties with China. In particular, and you'll learn this as you read the book if you don't know it already, Gyalo Dundrup went in 1945 to Nanjing to study in China, and he studied under the sponsorship of then President Chiang Kai-shek, who paid for all of his expenses there and became a very good and close friend of Gyalo Dundrup. And then the second experience that Gyalo Dundrup had, of course, that many of you know about, is that in 1979, after some 20 years of no communication between Tibetans and the Chinese, while Gyalo Dundrup was living most of his time in Hong Kong, he was approached by representatives of Xinhua News Agency, which is the unofficial representative, or at the time was the unofficial representative of the Chinese government in Hong Kong, invited first to meet with officials at Xinhua News Agency, and then was offered an invitation by Deng Xiaoping to visit China and to reopen talks between China and the Tibetans in exile. I demurred at first when asked to do this book. I thought, again, I was too busy. I thought I'm not a Tibet specialist. Finally, after trying to find somebody else, it didn't work, and there I was with Elsie Walker, arriving in New Delhi late one night to begin our journey to Kalimpong to meet Gyalo Dundrup and to begin the work on the book. So that's how it all started. I want to say also something about the title of the book, The Noodle Maker of Kalimpong. There are many things, as some of you know, that are controversial about this book. One of them is the title. I found that there are two very, very different reactions to the book. One of them is, or to the title, one of them is, oh, it's a marvelous title, I love it, and the other one is, oh my gosh, that's a terrible title. And I think in this room are people who would both kinds of people. Some of you would love the title, some of you wouldn't. But I do want, since the title has been so controversial, I do want to start by introducing you to the noodle factory in Kalimpong. There are no pictures of the noodle factory in the book, but I thought just to start things out, I might introduce you to what this noodle factory is all about. So this first picture here is taken from Gyalo Dundrup's compound in Kalimpong, and it is overlooking Mount Kanchenjunga, which I have to say I've spent months now in Kalimpong. I've only seen the mountain twice. Usually there's so many clouds that it's impossible to see the mountains, but this is one time that I was able to see the mountain. And here is the house on the compound where Gyalo Dundrup lives. It's a very American looking house, although the colors are different. The crows are sort of part of the story in the book. I've stayed on the compound many, many times, and early in the morning, at like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, the crows begin to caw, and they wake you up very early in the morning. Another shot here, this is looking across the compound from Gyalo Dundrup's house to a kitchen, and of course you can see the prayer flag and the stupa, which is usually lit with incense early in the morning when his staff arrives on the scene. This is a picture of the noodle factory itself. I write in the book that there is nothing modern about the noodle factory, that all of its machinery is very, very antiquated. You can see also that the building itself is very, very antiquated. This is a view from behind. This is the inside of the noodle factory. And I think if you can see that picture, you can also tell that I'm right, that the machinery is pretty antiquated and old-fashioned. Here's a scene of the noodles drying in the factory. Here's a picture of the women. The workers seem to be separated by gender. The men sort of make the noodles, and the women package the noodles. Did the microphone just go off? Can you still hear me? You can see also with the women, now I think it's okay, thank you. You can see the women in the factory. You can see that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is looking down on them when they work. And here is a picture of Gyalo Dundrup with His Holiness the Dalai Lama during a visit in 2011. And I just want to say something about that visit. I mean, one of the reasons the book is called The Noodle Maker of Kalimpong is because when I first began visiting Gyalo Dundrup, and I would go with him to the market, I would realize that very, very few people knew who he was. They knew him as the Noodle Maker of Kalimpong. They didn't know him as the older brother of the Dalai Lama, and they certainly didn't know what contributions he had made to the Tibetan cause. But in 2011, when the Dalai Lama came to visit Mr. Dundrup in Kalimpong and his picture was taken, all of a sudden everybody in Kalimpong knew that Gyalo Dundrup was the older brother of the Dalai Lama. And now if you want to go and visit Gyalo Dundrup in Kalimpong, all you have to tell the taxi driver is take me to the Dalai Lama's house, and he'll know exactly where to go. So that's sort of how the title came about, when I realized that this man who is known in one part of the world as the Noodle Maker of Kalimpong is in fact the older brother of the Dalai Lama and has made tremendous contributions. Good to see you. How are you? Welcome. And has made tremendous contributions to Tibet. But again, it's still a controversial title. So what I want to do now is just sort of take you through the book, giving you some of the highlights, and then I want to do this very informally, and I hope we'll have lots of time for questions and answers and interchange when I'm finished the talk. So I want to start in the Kumbum Monastery. Here is the picture that I think many of you have seen. One of the few pictures of the Dalai Lama taken before he arrived in Lhasa. This is as he and the family are waiting in Kumbum Monastery to hear whether they will be going to Lhasa and whether or not the little boy will become the next Dalai Lama. When the family finally does arrive in Lhasa, well, let me also show you some pictures of Kumbum. These are pictures that I took in Kumbum in 2003, long after His Holiness had left and gone to Lhasa. But for those of you who haven't had a chance to see it in many years, this is what it looked like in the winter of 2003. And there are a couple pictures here. So the life of the Dalai Lama's family changed tremendously once the family arrived in Lhasa. Among other things, the Dalai Lama himself, the little boy, moved to the Patala Palace, and the family moved ultimately into a very large 50-room mansion with both the mansion overlooking the Patala Palace and the Patala Palace overlooking the mansion. And here is a picture, I'm not sure if how familiar this picture is to you, but here is a picture of the Dalai Lama's mother standing on the roof of her house, which overlooks the Patala Palace. I've seen another picture taken from the Patala Palace looking over the family's house. So despite the fact that they were separated, the little boy and his family were still in sort of eye contact with each other across space. Gyalo Dundrup's life was unique among the family members of the Dalai Lama. From the time he was just an infant, his father already decided that he would not become a monk, in contrast to the other 4 male members of the family, that he would run the family business. But by the time they got to Lhasa and His Holiness was installed as the new Dalai Lama, a decision was made by the Dalai Lama's father and the Reading region that Gyalo Dundrup would go to China to study, which was a very, very unusual decision in that time. Very, very few people in Lhasa knew anything about China or the Chinese, but the Reading region and the Dalai Lama's father thought that China was going to be important to Tibet no matter what, and that it would be a good idea to send Gyalo Dundrup to China to study, which he did. He was there under the tutelage and the sponsorship of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. This is the very first picture taken in Nanjing of Gyalo Dundrup with Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek is right in the middle under the picture, and if you see the young man to the right in the picture with the short hair, that's Gyalo Dundrup at about age 15, and he has just very recently had his first haircut in his life. When he left Tibet, On his way to India, he had a long braid that went all the way down to his waist. And there are still, we do have a few pictures, one picture, maybe two pictures in the book of Gyalo Dundrup with his long braid and his dangling earring. But he was persuaded in India to cut his hair and take off his earring. And later he began wearing Western clothes. I think it's fair to say that Gyalo Dundrup's education in China had a very, very profound effect on him. He knew the minute he set foot in India that Tibet itself was, he calls it, backward, that it was in need of reform, and everything about his education in China convinced him of the need for Tibet to reform and to modernize. Gyalo Dundrup was, of course, the civil war between the nationalists and the communists began while Gyalo Dundrup was still a student. He fled essentially in 1949 at about the same time that Chiang Kai-shek left and fled for Taiwan. He returned to India thinking that he would be going back to Tibet, but in fact quickly became aware that there were still a whole lot of political problems inside Tibet and that maybe he'd better not go back. So he spent some time, well over a year, traveling first of all to Taiwan, then to the United States, and then only arrived back in Tibet in 1952 at the age of 22. So he'd been gone for some 7 years, hadn't seen his family since then, hadn't seen Tibet since then. And of course, at that point, the 17-point agreement had already been signed, and already there were signs of unrest in Lhasa. It was just after Gyalo Dundrup returned that the Chinese ordered the Dalai Lama to ask his two prime ministers to resign. Many people considered that a violation of the 17-point agreement, and people were becoming politically very, very restless in the streets of Lhasa. In Gyalo Dundrup's first meetings with the Dalai Lama, he was very, very pleased that the two of them seemed to see eye to eye about the need for reform in China. But the longer Gyalo Dundrup stayed there, the more people he met with, and he tried to meet both with, and did meet with both Chinese officials, most of whom were military people at the time, with Tibetan officials, trying to sort of convince people of the need to reform and trying to persuade them that this is the way to reform. I think he didn't get very much of a positive reaction, particularly from the Chinese. And after, not very long, after really only several months in Tibet, he slowly began to think that he could be, well, first of all, there was just no way for him to work in Tibet and be able to please both his brother, the Dalai Lama, and the Chinese. And of course, particularly, he was running into real problems with the Chinese and felt finally that it was probably best for Tibet if he left Tibet and began to try to work internationally to bring the cause of Tibet to an international community. So he fled without telling his brother to India, where he began pleading the case of Tibet to a number of international organizations, including, of course, the United States, and began traveling abroad to various countries, including the United States, trying to bring the plight of Tibet to a larger international community, which of course was also a very, very difficult task. I think sometime, and I'm not sure when, but sometime clearly the seed was planted in Gyalo Dundrup's mind that not only would Gyalo Dundrup be better off outside Tibet, but so would his brother, the Dalai Lama. And in 1956, and in fact before 1956, sometime in 1955, Gyalo Dundrup and others began negotiating with the Indians to bring His Holiness to India for the celebration of the 2500th anniversary of the birth of the Buddha, the Jayanti celebrations that were to be held in 1956. And according to Gyalo Dundrup, the negotiations went on for a very long time, but the people on the Tibetan side doing the negotiation were convinced that Prime Minister Nehru had agreed that when the Dalai Lama arrived in India, that he would be granted political asylum. And it was with that hope that Gyalo Dundrup had helped make the arrangements for the Dalai Lama to come. The Dalai Lama did arrive in India. He met with Prime Minister Nehru. He celebrated the Jayanti celebrations, stayed several months in India. But at the same time that the Dalai Lama was visiting, Premier Zhou Enlai from China visited India a couple of times, meeting both with Prime Minister Nehru, with the Dalai Lama, with Gyalo Dundrup and his brother Norbu, trying to convince Prime Minister Nehru not to grant political asylum to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And in the end, and the story is told differently by different people, but in the end, the asylum was not granted, and the Dalai Lama had to return back to Tibet. This was a very, very difficult time for Gyalo Dundrup, and I think, let me just read a couple of paragraphs from the book when he tells what it was like when he had to say goodbye to his brother in Sikkim to send him back to China. He says, "As I accompanied my brother to the Sikkim border to say our goodbyes, I had no doubt that he was returning to a horrible fate. I was convinced that I would never see him again. My brother was utterly serene. I stood in awe watching him take his farewell. He told us not to worry. I'm facing the truth," he said. "I'm facing the Lord Buddha. I'm going for the people of Tibet. I'm not frightened. My people are there." I felt something indescribably unique and special about my brother then, something I had first begun to feel in Lhasa, returning after so many years away. He was not an ordinary man. His equanimity, I thought, must be rooted deep in his Buddhist learning and faith. 2 years later, Nehru would change his mind and welcome the Dalai Lama back. I would come to thank him and the people of India for providing shelter to our people and helping us to survive. Eventually, I would come to consider Nehru a great leader, but at the time, I felt outrageously betrayed. So at the same time that Gyalo Dundrup was saying goodbye to his brother and having failed at arranging for political asylum for his brother, he had already been contacted by the American CIA. In fact, those contacts had been going on for several years, and it was very, very shortly after the Dalai Lama returned to Tibet after his visit to India that Gyalo Dundrup took the first group of young Tibetan men across the Mahanandi River, is that how you say it, into what was then East Pakistan, sending them off to be trained by the CIA to fight the resistance. So from then on, for a number of years, Gyalo Dundrup cooperated with the American CIA. Several hundred men were sent to the United States to Camp Hale in Colorado, in the mountains of Colorado, being trained to fight the resistance, and then were airdropped by the Americans back into Tibet to continue the resistance in Tibet. Several hundred Tibetans were trained in this way, and several hundred Tibetans were airdropped back into Tibet to continue the resistance. I think you probably all know that the resistance was not very successful. The Chinese were just infinitely better trained. There were infinitely more Chinese than there were Tibetans. The Chinese were just so infinitely better equipped. They had aircraft, they had guns, they had mobility, they had radios. I mean, they had all sorts of ways to communicate. And the Tibetans were simply no match for the Chinese. So that support lasted until the late 1960s, early 1970s. Gyalo Dundrup credits the end of American support for the Tibetan resistance to an agreement made between American Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and the Chinese. And essentially, what he says is that the price for reestablishing relations between China and the United States was the end of American support to the Tibetan resistance, and also withdrawal of recognition of Taiwan. Henry Kissinger is not one of Gala Dundrup's favorite people. Let me say something a little bit more about the CIA. This is not a secret right now. It's not been a secret for a long time. Many Americans have written about the CIA. And I think a lot of Americans give more credit to the American role in the Tibetan resistance than Gala Dundrup and probably many other Tibetans would want to give. And again, let me quote, well, one of the sort of issues of contention among Americans is how much support did the CIA give to the escape of the Dalai Lama from Lhasa in 1959. And Gala Dundrup, as I'll read to you, thinks that it was not because of the American CIA that Gala Dundrup escaped. So here, let me read a paragraph as he concludes what he thinks of this. He says, "Even after all these years, I'm still amazed when I think about the escape. A superstitious person could easily believe that it was a miracle, but the escape was not a miracle. It was a human effort by the few people closest to the Dalai Lama, Pala, his Lord Chamberlain, a couple of cabinet members, his personal attendants, advisors, bodyguards, and the resistance fighters. They were willing to sacrifice their lives, their families, everything to protect the Dalai Lama. Their plans never leaked out. They never told their families, never even had a chance to say goodbye. They arranged everything without outside help. The CIA did not help. The CIA did not even know about the escape until several days after the Dalai Lama was gone. Nor did I. The escape had nothing to do with the CIA, nor indeed with me." So true, but it's also true that when the Dalai Lama crossed the river into that part of Tibet that was essentially not controlled by the Chinese, there were a number of resistance fighters there to escort the Dalai Lama and his entourage across the border to India. And among those resistance fighters were two of the first two people to be trained by the CIA, including one of the people trained in radio operations. And so from very shortly after the Dalai Lama entered that territory, the radio operator was in radio contact with the CIA, and messages were going back and forth. I think they were going mainly to the CIA, not from the CIA, but in any case, messages were going to the CIA, and Gala Dundrup was then receiving those messages. Somebody from the CIA office in Calcutta was flying to Bagdogra and then on to Darjeeling, I think at that time, delivering the messages to Gala Dundrup. So they knew where the Dalai Lama was at sort of almost every step of the way. And finally, towards the end of the journey, after the entourage had learned what was happening in Lhasa and that so many people were being killed, they realized that they were not going to be able to stay inside Tibet, that they really did need to go to India. And so a radio message was sent again to the CIA asking Gala Dundrup to meet with Nehru and ask for political asylum. So Gala Dundrup, upon receiving that message, flew immediately to Calcutta, had a meeting immediately with Nehru, walked in the room. The first thing Nehru said is, how is His Holiness the Dalai Lama? And Gala Dundrup asked for political asylum, and at this point, Nehru said yes, of course. There was no question at that point that the political asylum would be granted both to the Dalai Lama and to his entourage. So for the next 20 years, following the Dalai Lama's escape to India, there was virtually no contact between the Tibetans and the Chinese. And then in late 1978, early 1979, Gala Dundrup was approached, as I said, by representatives of Xinhua News, who were in fact the unofficial representatives of the Chinese in Hong Kong. inviting Gyalo Dundrup to meet with Deng Xiaoping in Beijing. And after a little bit of negotiation, and the Chinese had decided to invade Vietnam in the meantime, which put a little damper in the visit. But after some negotiations, Gyalo Dundrup flew to Beijing and met with Deng Xiaoping. And I'm sure many of you know something of this story. It's told in as much detail as I could possibly get out of Mr. Dundrup in the book. But I think the most important sentence that Deng Xiaoping spoke in that meeting was, in Chinese, Chula Duli Iwai, Shamado Kaitan, meaning except for independence, everything can be discussed. So it was on that basis that the conversations continued. I think some of you in this room probably know a lot about what happened. I think the most immediate result of this first meeting was that after Gyalo Dundrup's visit, there were 4 delegations sent to Tibet to have meetings with friends and relatives and people of Tibet after, these 20 years. And I know some of you in the room were members of those delegations. And could talk about it much better than I could. I have to say that I think, to my own mind, the best description of those 4 delegations is in John Avedon's book, In Exile from the Land of Snow, which I think is really an excellent description of what happened. And just for the record, what I think the most startling and unexpected thing that happened from the Chinese perspective is that the Chinese had sort of come to believe their own propaganda and their own rhetoric about the love of the Tibetan people for Chairman Mao and the Chinese Communist Party, and the fact that the Dalai Lama was sort of out of the picture. But once people in Tibet learned that a delegation representing the Dalai Lama was visiting, the delegation was just absolutely flooded with hundreds and hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people who wanted to see this delegation, to touch the people on the delegation, and also to give notes and letters and petitions to these people. And I think the first delegation was probably far and away the most dramatic of all of the 4, but as I understand it, all 4 delegations had this marvelous reception from the Tibetan people, including lots of letters and lots of notes and petitions, which I think must be they must be a real treasure trove for people wanting to do research on Tibet, and I hope that someday someone will have access to those notes and petitions and be able to write about them. So Gyalo Dundrup then continued to meet with the Chinese over a period of years. With several different people. One of the people that he met with was Hu Yaobang, who some of you may know he was certainly, I think, probably the most liberal leader with respect to the issue of Tibet. I think he came as close as any Chinese to apologizing to the Tibetan people for what had happened in that 20-year interim with no contact. It was Hu Yaobang who presented Gyalo Dundrup with a list of 5 sort of conditions for the return of His Holiness to China. I've seen those 5 conditions, I think, appear differently in different places, and I'm not exactly sure which 5 are the right 5, but the one of the points that everybody agrees on is that Hu Yaobang said that he welcomed the Dalai Lama to return, that he could resume his position as vice chair of the National People's Congress, but that he would live in Beijing and only visit Lhasa. He would not be allowed to live in Lhasa because other people had already taken over the positions that he had held in Lhasa. And that condition, I think, was unacceptable to every Tibetan who knew what that condition was. So those negotiations didn't go very far. I might also mention another meeting that Gyalo Dundrup had, which is one of the several cases where I take exception to Gyalo Dundrup's description of what was happening. Gyalo Dundrup was scheduled to visit China in late September 1987. And he left, I guess, from India without knowing that big demonstrations had broken out in Lhasa on September 27th. And he arrived at the airport not knowing that demonstrations had broken out. And he met with Yenming Fu, who was then the head of the United Front Work Department, which was responsible for liaisons with the Tibetans. And Yenming Fu was quite convinced that the Dalai Lama was behind these demonstrations and claimed to have proof that there were foreigners involved in the demonstrations. And this is a point where Gyala Dundrup and I disagree. It's something that I want to continue to study, but Gyala Dundrup still believes that there was some sort of foreign intelligence at work in those demonstrations. So that is an issue for others to decide, I think, because it still remains very controversial in the book. I guess I would also like to mention another meeting that Gyala Dundrup had. The problem is I haven't shown you all the pictures, so I'm going to have to go through some pictures to show you this last picture. This picture is the picture of some of you may know that Gyala Dundrup got married in Nanjing. He married a Chinese woman who, by every account, was a wonderful, wonderful woman. And here is a picture of their wedding. Here is a picture of Lamo Tsering, who was Gyala Dundrup's very closest colleague and friend during all of this period cooperating with the CIA. And Lamo Tsering was sort of very active in the resistance to the very end. Here's a picture of some of the resistance fighters. And here is the picture of Gyala Dundrup with Deng Xiaoping during that meeting in March of 1979. And here's the picture that I want to show you, which is, do you know who this person is? This is Xi Jinping, who is the father of the current president of China, Xi Jinping. So Mr. Dundrup did have a meeting with Xi Jinping, which I have to say did not go well. Gyala Dundrup, for all of the delegations that had been to China, been to Tibet, Gyala Dundrup had not returned to Tibet. And it was during this meeting with Xi Jinping that he had expected to return at last to Tibet. But Xi Jinping said that he refused to allow Gyala Dundrup to go back to Central Tibet. He wanted him to go and visit his home in Amdo, but not to Central Tibet, because he said that there were skirmishes going along the border with India. And Gyala Dundrup was absolutely furious. And decided that he wouldn't go. Xi Jinping changed his mind, said, okay, you can go to Lhasa after all. Gyala Dundrup refused to go, and he did not return to Tibet until 2002, which was 50 years after he had left. And I have to say that there's only a very short description in the book of his return to Tibet. It's, to me, one of the saddest paragraphs, 2 paragraphs in the book. He says that there were minders with him everywhere he went. He never had a chance to say anything private or personal to anybody. He said that everything except the mountains and rivers had changed. And then he said that he felt nothing, which I thought was very, very sad, that after all these years to return home and feel nothing. So this is not a particularly happy book. Mr. Dundrup has, his major regret is his cooperation with the CIA. He thinks that was a terrible mistake. He feels responsible for the deaths that followed as a result of the cooperation with the CIA. But he does nonetheless end on a happy note, on a positive note, and I guess I should conclude by reading the last paragraph of the book, which reads on a happy note. We Tibetans have lost our land and our national independence. What we have never lost is our moral compass. Our belief in Tibetan Buddhism and His Holiness the Dalai Lama gives us a set of ethical values that is sorely lacking in China today. The Dalai Lama is still our deeply beloved moral guide. In this, we Tibetans have already won. China has much to learn from our values of tolerance and compassion and respect for human rights. Whatever happens, we Tibetans have begun our struggle for freedom and independence. That struggle will continue. The flame will not die. During a recent meeting with His Holiness the Dalai Lama when I was feeling ill, he insisted that I could not die. We have to return home together, he told me. I still believe that eventually the truth will prevail, that justice will be done, that Tibet will survive, and that we Tibetans will return home together. So that's the end of the book and the end of my talk.
Sorry for being late. We were actually up in TCB for the concluding ceremony of our Riglam Lobsen. That's traditional dialectic way of teaching. So His Holiness has this idea since 60s, and now we have implemented more rigorously from 2005-6 on. To introduce dialectic way of debating things and learning things in Tibetan schools. So we have all the 35 monk teachers, spiritual teachers, and nearly 200 or so students. So managed to get here.
I fully understand, no
Yes.
problem. Thank you
So,
for coming, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for giving the talk on very interesting topic, the Noodle Maker of Kalimpong, who is being brought up in that side of the world. I know how famous noodle is. But then Gyalo Thundu is known more for many other things which you have described in the book. Now, if I may, if I could ask a question. When you wrote this book, how easy, difficult, smooth, rough, complicated was it in your interaction with Gyalo Thundu? I'll share my own experience later. How was it? How was your experience? He is one of the giants of modern Tibetan history. I think there's hardly anything that happened with regard to Tibet that he was not involved one way or the other.
Yeah.
So how was he as a person, and what is your takeaway as far as him as a person and the book?
Okay, so the first thing to be said is that I have described myself for many, many years. I say my role in life is listening to people's stories, and I just love listening to people's stories. So I'm a very, very good listener, and a good interviewer, I think, which is why Elsie Walker wanted me to do this book. Mr. Dundrup is not a loquacious man. It's hard to get the story from him. So it takes a lot of patience. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of asking and re-asking questions. And of course, the whole time that I was doing this book, because I'm not a Tibetan specialist, I was reading as much as I possibly could about Tibet. And whenever I would see something different from what Gyalo Dundrup was saying, I'd go back to Gyalo Dundrup and say, well, so-and-so says this. What do you say to that? So that's where we had our difficulties sometimes, to see, why are you reading that rubbish? And finally, I learned that maybe I didn't need to read so much and ask him so many questions, because it was his story. And I think I hope I made that very, very clear in the introduction, that one of the basic human rights to me is the right to your own story, and I think that Tibetans have been denied that right for many, many years, and I wanted to give him the full right to tell his own story, so long as I had the introduction and the afterword where I could take exception with him when I really disagreed. So so he it was sometimes difficult to get information from him, and I think I've heard from people that they wish that there were more from him. But he has a fantastic memory. He has an excellent, excellent memory, and that was also very important.
What is your takeaway? What would you say after you read this book? What should we take away?
Well, let me tell you what Gyalo Dundrup wants you to take away, and I think that he's right, and I think that it's happening. He feels very much that his time is over, and he's an old man now. He's 86 years old, and he's frail, and he's retired from everything but making noodles. But what he hopes is that the next generation, the younger generation of Tibetans, will read this book. He understands that many don't know the history as he tells it in this book, and he hopes that the younger generation of Tibetans will learn from his mistakes And he believes that because the younger generation is better educated, is much more aware of the world outside, lives already in a more modern world, that they'll be able to find solutions that he couldn't find. And he says that he cannot claim any accomplishment right now in his life, and he wants the next generation to make those accomplishments. And I think, and listening, so here in Dharamsala, I've been meeting with many young people, and I'm very, very impressed with how important that book is to young people. And I also met in the United States with a group of young Tibetans before I came here, all of whom, were very, very moved, and they really appreciated the book. And I find that very important. I'm glad for that.
I think you mentioned that he thinks dealing with CIA was a mistake.
Yeah.
But I was told that he had a lot of regrets and complaints about meeting and negotiating other things with other people. If you could describe,
Yeah, so he doesn't say, he literally says in this book, I have only one regret, and that's the CIA. So he hasn't told me of other regrets that he has. And I will say it's very interesting here too, sharing this with young Tibetans. Gyalo Dundrup regrets it because he believes that had the CIA not become involved, had the resistance not gone on for so long, that fewer people would have died. He credits himself, which is a discredit to himself, for the many lives that were lost and for the destruction of Tibetan culture, and says that if it weren't for the resistance, if it weren't for the CIA, not so many people would have died, and not so much of Tibetan culture would have been destroyed. I have to say that I've spoken here with, as I say, a number of people, and somebody very, very clearly said, yeah, but we had to fight even knowing that we were going to lose, that we couldn't live with ourselves if we hadn't fought even against such a powerful enemy. So there are other ways to look at the CIA's involvement.
With that, now we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. While the audience ponder the question or questions, there has been, at least a social network, on Facebook, there's been a bit of writings by Tharong family and all that.
Right.
So what is your take on that, actually?
So first thing, I have said that I have an afterword in the book where I just had to allow myself to disagree with Mr. Dundrup on a number of issues. One of them was the issue of foreign involvement, and particularly foreign intelligence involvement in the demonstrations in 1987, and another is the case of Tharong. And I believe that he did not have the evidence to make the allegations that he made. We went back and forth about this, and he decided he wanted to keep that in, so it's there. I obviously that story is not ended, and I would be delighted to meet with anybody who can shed further light on that story, because I think it's only fair to give everybody a voice. But again, my responsibility to Gyalo Dundrup was to give him his right to tell the story. So the story isn't over yet.
Hello. First of all, I would like to thank you for this wonderful book. So my question is that with Mr. Gyalo Dundrup's long involvement with Tibetan issues, I think for more than 5 decades, I think 313-page book is very short, So I'd like to ask whether is there any plan of coming up with another volume?
No, you're right, and I, as I just said, I think one of the questions that comes up fairly often is we want more. He didn't tell us enough. I have to tell you very frankly that I think he's probably said pretty much everything he's going to say. Truly, I think unless there's somebody who's a much better interviewer than I am and has more time to spend with him, I think he's probably said just about everything he's going to say. I mean, it'd be interesting if there are some interviews with him about the book and if he might want to go further on some things, but I think this may be the last of his volumes. But again, I think that there are issues in here that need much further discussion and much further research, and that there should be more books and more articles about some of the issues that he deals with in the book.
I may have missed your description or introduction because I was not able to make it to the beginning. I was just wondering about the title of the book.
Yeah.
Noodle Maker of Kalimpong, as Sijong was talking about. He's one of the few giants of Tibetan history. Noodle Maker seems like kind of weird.
So if you want to stay later, I can show you the slides that I showed in the beginning of the factory and of the noodles. And I can tell you how, part of it just has to do with the fact that when I first began meeting with Gyalo Dundrup and spending time in Kalimpong, and I would go to the market with him, nobody knew that he was the Dalai Lama's brother. They knew him as the Noodle Maker of Kalimpong. And then suddenly the Dalai Lama visited, and everybody knew that he was the Dalai Lama's older brother, which they had not known before. And I'll show you some of those pictures. But I do want to say something else that came up at another meeting I had about the book, which has to do with if the Noodle Maker of Kalimpong were translated into Tibetan, which it hasn't been, it's possible by some slight little twist of the sound that he could be the troublemaker of Kalimpong. And I was asked whether that was deliberate, and I said no. I know no Tibetan, and if that's if there was nothing deliberate about the title and the possible implications of it being a troublemaker. Is that true?
So, I would like to share my anecdote of 1987.
Oh, good. Yeah, thank you.
Because
Actually, Abdullah was one of those who accompanied for the delegation
Okay.
in
for the negotiation.
1987, when the demonstrations took place in Tibet, a lot of foreign tourists.
Right.
Right. And then I and some of my young colleagues were walking in Delhi in our bureau office. So Mr. Gyalo Dundrup went to China, met some of the Chinese leaders, Young Minfu and all that sort of thing. He came back to Delhi and he was furious, calling three of us to his office and saying that Chinese have never shot against the Tibetans, no one has been killed and all that sort of thing. So, so we told him that at that time there were a lot of foreign tourists who were eyewitness to that. John Hadley from the United States, Totem Blake Carr, and then
Robbie Barnett.
Robbie Barnett and Nick Hall.
Right.
Normal now. They had brought all those pictures that people being shot dead and they were carried on the shoulders of the people and something like that. So when he said no one has been shot dead, so he said like you shouldn't tell lies to the international public. So we used to hold press conferences and all that sort of thing. So we went back to our office and brought all the pictures showing that these are the Tibetans who have been shot dead. So he said, I have never been told by the Chinese. They said no Tibetan has been shot dead, no guns have been fired. And so I think that's one of the anecdotes because he was convinced by the Chinese leaders that no one has been shot dead. So now he's also saying in the book saying that some foreign agents were involved in that, but then sometimes Chinese are very good in convincing people without showing evidence. So
That's right.
That's right.
I thank you. I appreciate that a lot. And actually, I really would like to write something about that episode and those demonstrations because there, as you say, there were a lot of foreigners there. And there were doctors there, and I think the reason you saw those pictures is because the Tibetans were bringing some of the victims of the shootings to the doctors. I mean, there was some sort of exchange going on, and the foreigners did take a role in trying to treat some of the wounded. But I think that there is still a story there that needs to be told that hasn't been told. And there were foreigners who saw an awfully lot who have never written fully about it. But thank you for sharing that. That was very interesting.
Nobody's take this opportunity. I mean, the final conclusion that you have said is that the greatest mistake he has made is the contracting with CIA. I mean, getting help of CIA. I mean, this is very surprising for me. I mean, most people actually, we outside, you know, they are saying that, I mean, this is, I mean, not rather, I mean, the eulogize, but rather, I mean, this is not a mistake, but it was a strategic decision to really get help of CIA. Otherwise, there was nobody else from the other world to assist the resistance. So, is that, I mean, the way Viswananda has said, you know, Chinese has been very good in convincing him. You know, maybe this may also be sort of a very good convincing to the Chinese that this has been one of the mistakes. Or it's really sort of really the final analysis that he has come to that conclusion.
I mean, certainly the reason that he gives for that regret is that so many people died and so much was destroyed, and he feels that the resistance and the fact that the Chinese knew about the CIA gave the Chinese an excuse that they wouldn't otherwise have had to do a lot of killing. I mean, I can't say how he may have been influenced by the Chinese point of view on that. And I understand what you're saying, and I know that a lot of people would disagree with him, that, you know, better to have fought than not. And of course, for many people, the resistance fighters are great heroes. And I think he would certainly respect that. I mean, he literally, the book starts with him every morning going outside and waiting for the sun to come up over the mountain and closing his eyes and thinking back over his life. And he still sees the faces of those young men who he sent off to Camp Hale, and he still, you know, tries to recite the names of the people who died. So, you know, that weighs very heavily on his conscience.
But an overall picture of, you know, in this moment of struggle, you know, I mean, it's very natural that many people have to sacrifice.
Right, exactly.
You know, to achieve a larger goal.
Exactly. And what you say, I think I've heard also from other Tibetans. Yeah, we had to do it. We couldn't not have done it. We had to fight. And I understand that. I think that's a very, very understandable sentiment. But if you're the one that sends somebody to fight and you live, then, you know, then you do have that guilt, or you can have that guilt.
Good evening. I think the book also spoke about Hugh Richardson, one of the writers and Tibetan supporter. But I think it's critically acclaimed about, you know, what is being described about him in the book. And as far as I know, he is an immense supporter of Tibet and Tibetan cause. So what do you say about this?
So yeah, he is also very harsh on Hugh Richardson. He really didn't like him. And with the few people, again, I think there is disagreement on the issue of Hugh Richardson too. Certainly, he did become very active in sort of working with the UN. He and Gyalo Dundrup traveled to New York together to talk about the Tibetan issue at the UN, and so they worked together even after all of these things that Mr. Dundrup has said about him. So I don't have an opinion on Hugh Richardson. I don't know. I've read his book, but I don't know his story well enough to make a judgment. And yeah, I mean, I think Mr. Dundrup is sometimes too harsh on people. I have to say that. How many of you have read the book? Not many. It hasn't. It's up in McLeod now. Oh, but some, huh?
I think after your talk, more will read for sure.
I hope so. I hope so. We can have another meeting after you all have read it.
Yes, that's true. So any other questions? I think they all want to read your book first and ask you questions. So, it's very kind of you to come to Dharamsala and spend this many weeks with Tibet Policy Institute. Actually, Professor Thurston has been giving a workshop, research-related workshop to the researchers of Tibet Policy Institute. We all know that Professor Thurston teaches at Johns Hopkins University, and the same curriculum that he was teaching at Johns Hopkins is given to TPI researchers. So after this workshop, I'm sure they are up to the Johns Hopkins standard. We hope so. And then we know actually Professor Thurston is well known. Before writing a book on Gyalthandula, she has written a book on Mao Zedong, and which became quite popular. And so we all know more as China experts or writer on China. Now I'm glad that you are siding, I don't want to use defecting, but siding with Dharamsala and Tibetans as well. And after your stay here, your interaction with the staff members of CTA, I'm sure you have gotten better insights as to how CTA does its work and how exiled Tibetans think and contribute towards the Tibetan cause. So in your upcoming many lectures promoting the book, we wish you all the best, and as you travel far and wide, do remember us and mention from time to time that this is the nerve center of the Tibetan freedom struggle, and we are quite vibrant, dynamic and active as much as we could, and then please come back, and so we will have more experience, and then your second volume on Gyalthandula's book and others, including Tsarong's version, will be included in your book. So we are looking forward to the second volume from your side. So with that note,
So wait, I need to say something else. I need to say something. Okay, yes, thank you. No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I want to make sure, because I think I need to repeat something that I said in the beginning, which is I had a marvelous, marvelous time here in Dharamsala. I thank Sempela from the bottom of my heart for inviting me. The students were absolutely marvelous. I loved every one of them. I've had a terrific time, and I'm happy to come back whenever I can. So thank you to the Tibetan Policy Institute and to you for making this all possible. I loved it. I've had a great time.
thank you.